topics, you'll always see something about that, whether it's multiple choice or an essay or something. The one that's going to rise up and bite everybody in the butt, and we don't know when, it's kind of like we're waiting for it, okay? It's kind of like waiting for the earthquake in California. You know it's going to happen, you know it's going to be massive. We're waiting for the Native American questions. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting, and we almost get a sense that they're lulling us into a sense of false security, because it's one of the things that they demand every year we spend time talking about, but they never have had DBQs or things like that. So it's out there. It's out there somewhere waiting for us. Okay. So first of all, with women's history, again, this is one of those trend type things. When you have questions, you guys remember this is all geared towards essay. When you have questions, especially like the evolution of a demographic unit, okay, women, African Americans, things like this, okay, it's good to get the basics in. So this is kind of just hitting the hot spots, okay. First of all, we started, you said, as thing is still frozen again. I'm not having a good day. Boop. Come on, you can do it. There we go. Okay, all right. Obviously, we start with women back in colonial America, okay? This is something I mentioned in class, but I'm not sure I mentioned it a lot. I'm not sure that Alan mentioned it at all, okay? So this is what we're going to talk about. Always remember, this is working. Okay, always remember, this is common sense, that the American colonies were of English descent, okay? So they're going to bring English traditions over. When it came to relationships between men and women, especially married men and women, the tradition that was brought over is ancient. It's called coverture. This is a real important thing. This is something, one of those things you can pretty much drop in any, if you're talking about women's rights and things, you can always put this in as reaching back and saying, okay, this is what tradition is. This is all coverture is. In this tradition, a woman's identity was covered by that of her husband. Okay? So in other words, Sophie ceased being Sophie. Okay? She became so-and-so's wife. Okay? Mrs. Scalia stopped being Marilyn Evans, and she became Mrs. Scalia. So in other words, your entire identity as a woman, okay, was covered by that of the man. That's where the tradition of women changing their last name when they get married comes from. You ever thought about that? When you get married, and some women today will keep their last name, their maiden name. But tradition is when you get married that you abandon your last name and you take the name of your husband, okay? And that's an example of coverture, right? So the male will come in and his wife will be defined through her husband, okay? That's an English tradition, been there for centuries, and it's an American tradition. It's one reason, and of course it stayed in place a long time. So in other words, when you're talking about issues with women's history, it starts somewhere. And in colonial America, it started with that, okay? So make sure you know what that is. That's a good thing to drop in an essay, okay? All right. When you're talking about women, it's what do they have a right to, what do they have not a right to. They do not have property rights in colonial America. And in marriage, they have no rights. The best way to describe it, it's almost as if women were slaves. Okay, for all practical purposes, they're property. And they're property by virtue not of somebody buying them, but of someone marrying them. So women don't have any rights whatsoever. Okay, they're there to be what will later become known as the Republican mother. You marry your husband. The whole thing is based on the biblical notion of Eve being taken from a rib of Adam, things like this. So things are very strict and very much tied to tradition here. Women have no rights. Okay? This is, of course, you've heard about this all year long. Okay? This is the evolution of coverture and the absence of rights. In this type of society, this paternal type society, women have a job, women have a role, but their role is to be a mother. That's it. Your job is to raise your kids, to make sure the house is a moral place and everything like this, and to teach your kids and to raise them to be young citizens. The reason it's called Republican motherhood, that has nothing to do with the Republican Party. Okay? It has to do with the type of government we have in the United States. We are a republic. Okay? So if you raise young Republicans, these are citizens that will serve the republic. That's why it's called the Republican mother. So, as a result of this is an evolution. Okay? The primary distinction that women will have throughout American history, even today, okay, is that of the Republican mother. Okay? It really came charging back in the 1950s. In the 1950s, if you weren't the Republican mother, my God, you must be a communist. Okay? So again, this is something that's very conservative, and it's a situation where sometimes you'll hear people, and fortunately not in your generation much, but in my generation, by God, that woman doesn't know her place. Okay? Well, the place she doesn't know is that of the Republican mother. So it's demeaning, okay? It's condescending, but traditionally that's what a woman's role was in society, okay? If you live in a country where you don't have personal liberties and freedom, it stays like that and festers and festers and festers, okay? But we're talking America, where people do have personal liberties. So you know it's not going to be long before women are going to try to break out of this mold. That's been the long struggle for women throughout history. One thing to keep in mind, and guys, we always try to draw relevance to this because you're writing this down. Last year, 2 years ago, when Hillary Clinton lost the election to Donald Trump, the first thing she said, and she still says this today, I lost because I was a woman. Okay? I lost because men are not prepared to take women in that type of leadership role. Okay? And a lot of people say, yeah, sour grapes and stuff like that. But there is something to be said for that. Okay? America elected an African-American president before they elected a woman president. And one reason is because the African-American thing was racial. That's a social construct. But when you talk about women, okay, that's biblical. That goes back to Adam and Eve. So when you're talking about women, always remember that the fact that women have had to fight hard to break out, okay, is very deep and has very deep roots. Okay? Okay. Two people you probably need to know here. Okay? First of all, Anne. Remember that Anne was in Puritan New England? And she's the one that charged the Puritan fathers for preaching a covenant of works instead of covenant of grace. The biggest thing about Hutchinson is this, okay? She preached the concept of antinomianism. How many of you guys remember what that is? Something remember? What is Sophie? I'm going to embarrass you.
It's like you can have a personal relationship with God.
Bingo! Absolutely right. Guys, antinomianism is a form of religious freedom. That's the way to look at it. It's a form of religious freedom. What antinomian said, I don't need a Puritan elder to tell me if my soul is saved or not. I don't need a Catholic priest to give me an indulgence, okay? I have a personal relationship with God. If I want to hit my knees and pray, I'll pray to God. I don't need a conduit to do that for me. So antinomianism is a form of religious freedom. You have a personal relationship with your God, okay? The fact that it came from a woman is why a lot of people have turned their back on it, because she's a woman. When she's preaching something that was considered blasphemous like this, okay, what was she accused of being? Witch. Absolute, okay. Lady had guts. She stood trial. We talked about that in class, and she stood up to John Winthrop and went back and forth with him. She knew she couldn't win. She could not win in the city on the hill paradigm, okay. So eventually she was banished, because to execute her would have caused a riot, pretty much. She was banished, and eventually she ended up being killed by Indians in New York. Okay? So she's one of the first great crusaders for women's rights. And the basic thing is, all she wants to be is free. She wants to be free to worship her God. Okay? Then this is the grand old lady of women's liberation, women's freedom. Abigail Adams. If there was any justice in the world, she would have been elected president instead of John. Remember, one reason we show you the John Adams video every year is to get kind of the visual of the relationship these two had. She was, for all practical purposes, a co-president. John Adams didn't trust any of his advisors. He trusted none of his cabinet. For God's sakes, he had Hamilton on his cabinet. They hated each other. So he trusted her. He would write her letters back and forth from the Capitol to Massachusetts, back and forth, asking her policy questions, and she would write him back. You can read these letters. You can Google and read them. Okay? So she was his number one advisor. When he was writing her from the Constitutional Convention, okay, she said, I'm glad you guys are making a new nation. I'm glad you guys are finally throwing off the yoke of tyranny from Great Britain. But don't forget, there's more than one gender in this country. When you make up this new code of laws, remember the ladies. And what she's saying is when you write this Constitution, don't leave us out. Don't treat us like we're second-class citizens. Remember us, okay? And John, of course, was an idiot and he didn't forget them. So remember, she's the first big person pushing for political rights for women. She wants women to be part of this republic, and she doesn't want the part to be simply nothing more than motherhood. If you remember on one of the tests we gave you guys, there was an excerpt by Abigail Adams, and she was talking about education, okay? She was a huge advocate of women's education. Up to that time, if you had any type of education beyond being taught by your mother at home, okay, it was solely a male thing. Only males could go to school. Only males could go to college. Women didn't do that because they're a Republican mother. And if you'll remember what she said in the article, she said, okay, you didn't expect us to sit here and raise your kids, okay? And that's fine. But what happens when we don't have the knowledge to teach your kids? It's a self-defeating dynamic here. So she was a huge advocate for women getting education. Okay, early 1800s, after Jefferson's Revolution. Okay, we start to define what a woman's role is. Okay, the cult of domesticity. It's like, if you're a woman, this is your world. Your world is the home. Okay? And that's what this means. Anything in the home is your world, your environment. That's where you live. You control. You are the queen of the castle. Okay? So in other words, the home, what happens in the home, the cleanliness, the morality, the meals that are cooked, and things, all this stuff, the orderliness, everything, it's the job of the woman. So the woman's job is to take care of the home. Okay? And that's what the cult of domesticity is. Guys, one thing to remember about this is, as American history has gone on, some of this stuff has not been erased. Okay? There are still attitudes in this country today, and sadly so, where women are told, okay, your job is to sit here and keep the house clean, make the babies and make the biscuits, and that's it. Okay? That attitude still persists in some places. Okay? Okay. Separate spheres is another one. This is the one that the Lowell girl shattered. There's a man's world and there's a woman's world. The man's world is to go out and make the money, become involved in politics, own the land, farm the land, all of this manly stuff. Okay? It was funny because there was a presentation made the other day in the, oh gosh, what ballet am we doing down here? Did you guys hear that about toxic masculinity? That tickled the crap out of me. It's in the capstone thing. They're giving a presentation, and one student gave a presentation about this thing called toxic masculinity. And what they're saying is pretty much is that men have been so tied into this separate spheres thing for so long that they believe the point where this is a man's world. And it's a man's world, and this is how a man's supposed to act, what a man's supposed to do, and women can't get even near it. Stay away, you know. And of course, it gets to a point where it gets kind of overblown. The fact of the matter is men would categorize women to being a Republican mother, to living in the cult of domesticity, and staying in their sphere. You're a woman, this is your place, you stay there. Okay? And this is going to redefine what women are. So if you want to think of them as second-class citizens, okay, they are. They can't vote, they can't own property, all they can do is keep the house. And that was their job. That was their only job. This is how pervasive this got. Listen carefully. This is in the early 1800s. This was the subject of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. When Betty Friedan wrote that book in the early 1960s, that's what she was talking about. If I'm the Republican mother, the cult of domesticity, and the separate spheres, I'm a college graduate. Is that it? Is that all my life is good for, is to be this antiquated notion of what a woman's supposed to be? So guys, these things won't change. These things will persist throughout history. In the 1950s, because of the conformity, this stuff came back on steroids. Okay? We're going to watch some videos in here of shows like I Love Lucy. If you ever watch shows like Leave It to Beaver, when you see those shows, that's what America was supposed to be. If you've ever watched these television shows, it's really strange because the mother, she gets up in the morning, she fixes breakfast for the kids. Everybody on the table and everything like that. She fixes coffee for her husband and stuff like this. And the kids go to school, the husband goes to work. Well, the mother gets to work, okay? And she's dressed up, she's got pearls on, she's got a dress on, and she's cleaning the house, okay? I've seen Mrs. Scalia clean the house. She ain't wearing no dress and she ain't wearing no pearls, okay? She's making me help her. But anyway, what happened is that was your domain, okay? When they came home in the afternoon, the mother had dinner on the table, okay? She served the husband, she served the kids. She was there to serve, and that's all she did. And that's all she did for the rest of her life. She sat and trained her daughters to do the same thing. Okay? So this is something that will maintain itself. It won't change a heck of a lot. This is a biggie. Just a biggie. I was looking the other day when I was going through questions to put on your next test, and I think it was the 2016 test. And the 2016 long answer question was that. It was about the effect of the Second Great Awakening on reform movements. Okay? So that's a pretty big deal. And the reason the Second Great Awakening is under women's history, because it's a women's thing. Okay? Women benefited most from the Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening, because it changed the demographic of America, because America is moving over the Appalachian Mountains, because the yeomen are coming into power, it changed the demographic and it changed the social status. Okay? Women will still be pretty much second-class citizens, but they have finally found their niche. They finally found that one thing. Guys, it's like if you're rock climbing and you're sitting here on a solid face of granite and you want to go up and there's nowhere to grab a hold, okay? And you see one little small crack you can wedge your fingers in, okay? That's the only way you can go up, so you wedge your fingers in there, okay? That's what women were doing with the Second Great Awakening. It gave them that one handhold where they could escape merely being the Republican mother, okay? And the handhold was reform. Remember, if you're the champion of morality in your home, okay, then reform movements is how you're going to reform your society. Women grabbed onto this with both hands and held on and would never let go. They still haven't let go of it. Okay? So reform is going to be a liberating factor for women. It's going to give them something to do besides raise their kids. Now they have a social function. That's important. They've got something they can do to benefit society. Okay? So reform movements in the Second Great Awakening is going to be huge. Okay? It's one of the first big breakouts that women are going to enjoy. And because it's morality, and because part of being the Republican mother is ensuring morality in the home, okay, there's not a thing men can say about it. Okay? So they're going to embrace this. These are the three reforms that they're going to get involved with. Okay? The abolition movement will be a big one for women. It will be pretty small because it never was very big. The temperance movement was always one. Of course, that's anti-drinking. And after the women are forced to abandon the American Abolition Society in London, they will take on the cause of suffrage. Okay? If you don't remember that, just listen carefully, just remember, abolition was the hot project of the day. Okay? It's growing. You're starting to have people talk about the moral evils of slavery other than the economic and social ones. So women get involved in this big time, and they're very successful. They're very successful. You're talking about people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Sojourner Truth, people like this. When they go to London to an international meeting of abolitionist societies, they're not allowed to go into the convention. And the reason is, in Britain, women were not allowed in there. And of course, they got pissed off about it. Who wouldn't? William Lloyd Garrison, who was the leader of the thing, said, okay, ladies, I'm sorry, you got to go home. So they went home. When they got home, they said, okay, and guys, this is a major deal. Please remember this, okay? It's one of those great moments in history when the little light bulb goes off. There weren't light bulbs back then, so a little candle goes off, okay? I said, okay, first of all, we are adding so much to the abolition movement. We are so effective, okay? Why they kick us out? Why can't we matter? And then it just hits them in the face. We don't matter. We're women. We don't matter. And the reason we don't matter is we have no political power. Guys, that's the importance of them getting kicked out of the abolitionist movement. They realized in America, in a republic, okay, if you don't have any political power, you mean nothing. Absolutely nothing. And guys, there are just as many women as there are men in the United States. It's not like it's a majority-minority type of thing. So they finally start to realize if we get political power, okay, then they have to listen to us. Okay? That epiphany right there is what led to the women's suffrage movement. Women discovered we have got to get the right to vote. So, when that happens, that pretty much becomes the number one goal of all women, is to get the right to vote. Okay? And that's going to lead, obviously, to Seneca Falls, where they're going to have the Seneca Falls Declaration. So from 1848 on, the number one focus of women reform will be suffrage. They're going to fight to get the vote. Second behind that will be temperance. Temperance obviously will result in prohibition in 20th century, and women will get the right to vote in 1920. They are very similar in the ways they came about. We'll talk about that in just a second. Okay. You need to know her pretty much. She and some of her cohorts, okay, I'll put these up here, Lucretia Mott, the Grimkes, okay, they were all the ones that wrote the Declaration. Dorothea Dix, if you remember, what's unusual about her is she was not a suffragette. She was not one of the ones that pushed women's voting because she was focused on prison and asylum reform. One reason why it's probably important to know Dorothea Dix is when you're talking about women leaders, she's the anomaly. Okay, she's not one that was campaigning for temperance and then rolled over into being a suffragette for the vote. She was focused 1,000% on prison and asylum reform. And because of that, guys, that lends credence to you. That lends credibility. Because you're just not somebody following a fad. You've got your own agenda. Okay? She was probably as influential as the rest of them were in her own way. She probably had more respect for people because she didn't fall in line with what some people consider to be the latest fad of suffrage. But remember, this is all part of what came out of the Second Great Awakening. If you're writing about this, the context for all this is the Second Great Awakening. Do yourself a favor when you go to college, and if you have room for an elective, and take a women's history class, especially if you're a guy, because we don't learn things like that and everything, but it's extremely interesting, because you're looking at people who share, especially if you share your household with you. One reason that I am so proud of my wife, Mrs. Clea's got her own little revolutionary thing going on. When she was in high school, she played basketball at Sci Fair. In fact, you ever go to Sci Fair and you look up at the board up there which says the all-time scoring leaders, she's number one. She's the all-time scoring leader at Sci Fair High School. She went to UT and played for Jody Conrad, who was a national championship winning coach at that time. The thing about it is nobody cared about women's basketball. Nobody when she played in high school, they played three-person basketball. Not enough girls played, so you had to play with three people. The whole state did that. They won the state championship 3 times. Okay? And the thing about it is when she got in college, she transferred from Texas over to Sam, and when she got through playing everything, that was it. Guys, there was no WNBA. When you played basketball, if there was women's basketball in college, then there's no WNBA. But they formed a pro league in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay? So she went up there. She went there and she actually played pro basketball for about 3 months before the league folded. And the reason it folded is it's supply and demand, guys. There's no demand for women's basketball in the 1980s, okay? So again, it has to start somewhere, And that's why these people right here, there's no guaranteed success when you're a social crusader, okay? So these guys are real pioneers. Okay. After the